You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. First big series of the year. Hope you all have enjoyed our content that we had in January and February so far. Had some awesome one-off episodes and some content for Spiritual Abuse Awareness Month in January. I really enjoyed getting to have those discussions. But now we're moving into our first big series of the year, and that is going to be on Exodus, as you could probably tell by the title. This is not going to be the whole book of Exodus, though. That would take way too long, and I just find if we're on the exact same topic for too long, it gets a little monotonous. So we're going to get at least out of Egypt with this. So roughly around chapter 15. We might get to Sinai, not 100% sure yet. We did already do an episode on the Ten Commandments, so you can go back and check that out. But we're at least getting out of Egypt, so I can promise you that much. The rest we'll figure out when we get there. So let's do as we always do and talk through the stuff you don't know about. If you are new to some of our larger series that we do, I would definitely recommend you go back and listen to our Genesis 1 through 6 and 7 through 11 series. It's not going to be absolutely required to understand this series, but Exodus builds on a lot of the themes that were established in the first 11 chapters of Genesis, so it would be really helpful to have that foundation as we move into this. And whenever we do a larger series, we like to start off with an episode going through the stuff you don't know. I always say it's because there's two types of things you don't know in the world. There's the stuff that you don't know, and the stuff you don't know. I can tell you right off the bat, I do not know how to change the oil in my car and do it safely and well, all right? So that is something that I don't know how to do, but I know that I don't know how to do it. However, there are also things in life that you don't know, but you don't realize you don't know them until someone points them out. They're blind spots, and by definition, you don't realize a blind spot is there until someone tells you it is. And that's the kind of thing that gets in the way of a lot of Bible interpretation, because when we're reading this document in English, it's easy to think that our culture isn't that different from the culture of Bible times, and we start to import in our own assumptions based on our own experiences in life onto this ancient set of documents. And so sometimes the stuff that we don't realize that we don't know about the ancient world makes a big difference in understanding the book. So I like to just set aside this time up front to give you kind of that background stuff, the things that it's going to really help to know this as we go through the study, so I don't have to keep pausing and interrupting the study once we actually get into the book itself. So let's just start off with the name, Exodus. Where does that come from? Well, not Hebrew, because as we mentioned with Genesis, the Hebrew books of the Bible are titled based on the first word or two of the book itself. So that was just their way of saying, hey, this is the book name, let's just go with the first couple of words. So, for example, in Genesis, it's Bereshit. That's the very first word of the book, and it has the general idea of in the beginning or at the start, when. So with Exodus, the Hebrew title is actually Ele Shemot. Those are the first two words of the book, Ele Shemot, and they literally just mean, these are the names. We didn't get the title Exodus until the Septuagint came around, and they gave this book a Greek title, Ex Hodis, or literally the way out. Ex is a preposition, or can be a prefix too, that means out of, and Hodis is a way or road. So you have Ex Hodas, the way out. And it came over into English as Exodus. And while I certainly have no problem with that Greek or English title for the book, there's something important about the Hebrew title that we need to pay attention to as we study this book. And that's the fact that it is drawing attention to this genealogy that the book begins with. And I know most of you, when you hear genealogy, you're going to roll your eyes, breathe a heavy huff, and say, really, again? But yes, it's okay. This is a very short one, and it's just there to show you that this book is connected to Genesis. It's so easy for us to read scripture in bits and pieces, little bite-sized, maybe a verse or 5 verses at a time or something like that. And that's not necessarily wrong, but every part of scripture exists within a broader context. And so Exodus is really Genesis part 2. That's the best way that you can think about this. And the author wants you to know, because he begins this book with a direct connecting point back to how Genesis ended. So I want you to know this is not a whole new thing. This is continuing on the story that we just finished over there. So if it helps, think of Exodus as Genesis Part 2. It keeps the stories tied together. And just like every passage has a greater context, so does the book as a whole. The entirety of Exodus exists within its own cultural context. Most of the time, the Bible is the only ancient document that people read. And, that makes sense. I realize that you have to be a pretty big nerd to want to be reading works of literature that are 2,000 plus years old. Like, most people aren't doing that. It's hard enough to read Shakespeare from 400 years ago, let alone something that's been translated probably a couple hundred years ago, and the work itself is like 2,000 plus years old. I get it. But the problem with the Bible being the only ancient book you read is that you start to think it's entirely unique in ways that it often isn't. Now, I'm a Christian, and I do believe that the Bible is a very special book, but it is not entirely unique on its own. And a lot of times when people think, oh man, there's no other work of literature like this, that just goes to show they haven't read other ancient documents. The Bible is a product of its culture, and it frequently references and riffs off of, and sometimes even debates, other documents and aspects of the culture that it was in. But we don't always realize that because we don't live in that same culture, and we don't always catch those analogies. If one of my friends had a big job interview, and I said, "May the Force be with you," we would all know what I'm referencing, right? Even if you're not a Star Wars fan, what's wrong with you? But no, seriously, even if you weren't a Star Wars fan, May the Force be with you is Star Wars. It's just a part of our culture. And Star Wars doesn't have anything to do with his job interview, right? So what am I actually saying to him? I'm saying good luck. Why not just say good luck? Well, because there's a fun cultural connotation with Star Wars, and if you know me, I love Star Wars a little too much, so it has a lot of meaning to me. All of that is just wrapped up in that one little statement from a made-up science fiction story. But we all know that because we're from this same culture. But let's say I throw in a quote from a really popular Bollywood movie. You would probably miss the reference. I could fill this entire episode with references to, Guatemalan culture, and you'd never know. It would go over your head. Now, by the way, I don't actually really know any Bollywood movie quotes or much about Guatemalan culture, so you don't have to worry about that. But you get the point. You're not going to notice those cultural cues because you're not from those cultures. It's just going to go over your head. And the Bible is the same way. It is full of these hyperlinks to the culture of its day that we don't always recognize because it's not our culture. So let's talk about some of these and just try to get in the mindset of the ancient world where this story would have been written. Let's talk Moses. He's a pretty unique figure, right? Well, yes and no. There are surprisingly a number of ancient myths of people who match on to the Moses story a lot more than you might think. First one we're going to talk about is Sargon. Sargon of Akkad. Sometimes you'll see Sargon the Great, Sargon of Agad. There's a few different ways that he can be labeled, but he lived about 22 to 2300 years before Jesus, and he was the first ruler of the Akkadian Empire. He's often thought to be one of the first recorded emperors in human history. And we have what claims to be an autobiographical work from him, often called The Legend of Sargon. I'm going to read you a little excerpt from that and see if you can notice any overlap with Moses' story. Sargon, the mighty king, king of Agad am I. My mother was a changeling, my father I knew not. The brothers of my father loved the hills. My city is Azupiranu, which is situated on the bank of the Euphrates. My changeling mother conceived me. In secret she bore me. She set me in a basket of rushes. With bitumen she sealed my lid. She cast me into the river, which rose not over me. The river bore me up, and carried me to Aki, the drawer of water. Aki, the drawer of water, lifted me out as he dipped his ewer. Aki, the drawer of water, took me as his son, and reared me. Aki, the drawer of water, appointed me as his gardener. You notice any parallels there? Yeah. How about his being born in secret and put in a river, specifically in a basket that was sealed up with bitumen? It was made of bulrushes, and then he was drawn out of the water and raised as somebody else's child. Very interesting. Now, I'll get more into some of the dissimilarities between some of these stories and Moses' story in just a minute here, but I do want to say up front, this is a connection you'll often find online of people who just recently found out about the Sargon legend, and they say, oh, see, Moses wasn't real, he was actually Sargon, and the Bible stole this story and all that. No, not really. It is true that this legend existed long before the Bible was written. I mean, Sargon ruled before Abraham was even born. And so this story definitely predates Moses' story. So it is certainly possible that there is cultural overlap in the way some of these stories developed, but that is not the same thing as saying Moses' story is all fake because it overlaps a little bit with Sargon's. As we're going to see with a couple more stories here, there is a prominent motif throughout ancient literature called the abandoned hero motif. Sometimes you'll also see it as abandoned child motif, but it's usually called abandoned hero. And it's where the hero of the story is abandoned by their parents and has to kind of find their own way, and they're often raised by someone else. I mean, heck, we even kind of see that with Star Wars, right? With the original trilogy, where Luke is abandoned by his parents and raised by someone else. Now, I realize technically not quite, but for storytelling purposes, it fits closely enough. So we're familiar with it, even in more modern storytelling. I mean, Harry Potter is very similar too. So it's very possible that this ancient Sargon legend affected the way that the biblical authors presented Moses' story. But that doesn't mean that they just copied and pasted it, as we'll see in a few minutes here once I kind of critique the similarities and dissimilarities of a few of these stories altogether. But before we get there, let's look at the story of Horus in the river. Now, Horus was an ancient Egyptian deity often associated with the sky and ruling and a handful of other things depending on which dynasty was in power at the time. But one of the myths surrounding the birth of Horus is that when he was very young, his mother Isis hid him in a papyrus basket in the marshes to protect him from his wicked uncle Seth, who was another ancient Egyptian god. So it's interesting that we don't just have a legendary story like the legend of Sargon, but also built into the mythology of the Egyptian gods, we have the story of a child being abandoned in the river. I want to look at one other tradition that overlaps with Moses' story, and this one hits even a little closer to home. It is, and I say this with a massive asterisk, possibly the Egyptian version of the Moses story. Now, in order to trace back what's going on here, we have to go to Josephus. Now, Josephus was quite the character, and I definitely recommend checking out the podcast Biblical Time Machine for more on Josephus. They've done several episodes explaining his life, but the brief rundown is he lived right after the time of Jesus. He was born just a few years after Jesus would have died, and he died roughly around 100 CE. He was a Jewish military commander at the time of the uprisings against Rome, and around 67 CE, he tried to fight the Romans, failed, and he was stuck in a cave with some of his soldiers, and they basically decided it was going to be more honorable to commit suicide than to surrender to the Romans. So they have this whole thing where they're all supposed to kill each other, basically. And it gets down to Josephus and this one other guy, and they're like, all right, we're going to do this at the same time. And the other guy did, and Josephus supposedly didn't. He then gets captured by the Romans. He claims that the Emperor Vespasian is the fulfillment of a prophecy, and of course the emperor liked that and took him on as a historian of the Jewish people. So Josephus is quite a complicated character, and whenever he's telling a history, he has a bent to the story. He's trying to present the Jewish people in a good light so that Rome doesn't antagonize them or treat them badly, but he's also cowtailing a little bit to Rome at times. And he tends to be quite disdainful of Israel's enemies. So we should always take Josephus' stories with a bit of maybe a shaker of salt instead of just a grain. That being said, though, he is an extremely important and influential historian, particularly for that time, around the time of the writing of the New Testament. Like, he helps to corroborate and sometimes complicate stories from the Bible. But in one part of his writing, he mentions an Egyptian historian priest who was known as Manetho. And we don't have full manuscripts of Manetho's work. Some people even question his existence. But we he's kind of a mythic figure in ways. It seems likely that there was actually a Manetho hundreds of years before Josephus, and his legend just kind of grew over time. Like in a couple hundred years, we have legends about George Washington and Abraham Lincoln and the chopping down the cherry tree and all that stuff that we realize it's not accurate, but they've just become part of the larger story of that character. And that's in a couple hundred years. So it can certainly happen with someone that's several hundred years before Josephus. So while we don't have anything directly from Manetho, we do have large excerpts and summaries of his writings from historians who referenced him around the time of Jesus. And Josephus recounted a tale of an ancient Egyptian king who once decided to remove all lepers from his land so as not to displease the gods. And supposedly this pharaoh cast out 80,000 people from Egypt to work in the quarries on the east of the Nile. But some trouble arose when one of the priests pointed out that some of these priests have leprosy too. And if you're going to cast them all out of Egypt just to please the gods, like, aren't you going to tick off the gods for sending away the priests too? So one of these priests, whose name was Osarsiph, he starts up a little bit of a rebellion amongst all of these people who had been cast out of Egypt, and he makes up a bunch of new laws for them to follow, specifically recorded as being the opposite to the customs of the Egyptians. So pretty much whatever they did in Egypt, he says, all right, now we're going to do the opposite. So he gathers a bunch of people there. According to the legends, he also gets together around 200,000 shepherds, and he invades Egypt with them. The pharaoh, whose name was Amenophis, he responded by hiding images of the gods, sending away his 5-year-old son for his own protection, and then leaving Egypt himself with 300,000 soldiers and a great number of animals to go into exile in Ethiopia for about 13 years. And according to Josephus's account of Manetho's supposed account, this priest Osarsiph, now that he is ruling over Egypt with all of these people who had been cast out, he changes his name to Moses. Yep, you heard that correctly. Then after the 13-year self-imposed exile is up, the pharaoh returns with an army, and he coordinates with his now adult son, who is returning with another army, and they fight against this band of outcasts that had taken over Egypt. And as the legend goes, they killed and cast out all of these people into the region of Syria. Oh, there's one other that I meant to share as well. I know I said that was the last one for Moses, but there is one other account that's fascinatingly similar to this. And this comes from Tacitus. He was a Roman historian from the time of Jesus as well. And he wrote similarly about a disease that had broken out all over Egypt. Remember, with the Manetho account, there were a bunch of lepers, and the pharaoh was trying to cast them out. That's what started the whole thing. So Tacitus says, yeah, there was some disease that had come over all Egypt. And the pharaoh consulted the oracle of Hammon, possibly Ammon. There's some debate over what exactly that means. But Tacitus goes on to write, and I quote, "The people who had been collected after diligent search, finding themselves left in a desert, sat for the most part in a stupor of grief, till one of the exiles, Moises by name, warned them not to look for any relief from God or man, forsaken as they were of both, but to trust to themselves, taking for their heaven-sent leader that man who should first help them to be quit of their present misery. They agreed, and in utter ignorance began to advance into the wilderness at random. After a continuous journey for 6 days, on the 7th they possessed themselves a country from which they expelled the inhabitants, and in which they founded a city and a temple." End quote. So what do we do with these different versions of the biblical account? Things that seem really similar, but they're not the way the Bible put it. And it's really easy for some Christians to just jump up and say, well, obviously the Bible's right and those other stories are wrong. Okay, well, why, though? You can't just make that assertion. Like, I get it. You believe the Bible, that's fine, but why? We can't just say, this is our religious text, and so therefore we're right and you're wrong. I mean, what if you were born on the other side of the aisle? What if you actually believed a different set of religious texts? Like, would that make them right? No. And this does get complicated, especially since some of these stories, particularly the Sargon one, are older than the biblical accounts. So it's not like we can just get away with saying, oh, the other cultures ripped off the Bible. It's like, no, it kind of went the opposite direction. But that being said, there aren't just similarities between these stories. There are also dissimilarities. For example, in the abandoned hero stories, you almost always have some supernatural figure prophesying something at the baby's birth or shortly before or after the baby is born. And it's usually some sort of a bad omen of what is to come. We don't have that in Moses' story. There's also the matter that in an abandoned hero motif, it's usually because the child is unwanted, and that's certainly not the case with Moses, although there are instances where it's for his own protection, like in the Horus account. Another dissimilarity is the social status of the birth parents versus the surrogate parents. In a lot of abandoned hero motifs, the child often comes from a wealthy or even divine family and then is raised by someone of low status. However, with Moses, he comes from a slave family and is then raised by the princess of Egypt. So there are some people who have actually suggested that the Moses story is not a version of the abandoned hero motif, but actually an inversion of it. It seems that Moses' story does indeed follow the general outline, but in almost a reversed fashion. So I think that's a helpful middle ground to take on this. So we're not saying, oh, the Bible copied all of those other stories word for word, and we're also not saying that those other stories were based on the Bible. We're able to say, yes, the Moses story was written with those in mind, but it was written almost as an inversion of that common motif to show you that from the ancient Jewish point of view, there is something very special about this Moses. And yes, he's similar to some of these other legends. Like, we're going to play with your mythology, but we're also going to make it our own. And that's often how the Bible works. It riffs on other documents from the ancient world and then just slightly changes it around to make it its own version of the story. And as for the Manetho and Tacitus accounts, I mean, with Manetho, I'm not 100% sure how much of that was something that some ancient Egyptian priest historian actually said and how much Josephus was making up. But it is interesting to see the overlap there with Tacitus, where they both suggest that Moses would have been either leprous or part of this diseased group of people that were cast out of Egypt. Especially when you consider the second sign that God gave Moses to perform before Pharaoh. Now, we're not talking about the plagues yet. That all comes a little bit after this. But do you remember when Moses first approaches Pharaoh and says, let my people go, the signs that God gave him to perform? The very first one was casting his rod on the ground. It would become a serpent, which, oh my word, that passage is so much fun. I cannot wait to get to that. But do you remember the second one? It was for him to put his hand in his robe and pull it out with leprosy on it and then put it back and it's healed. So that's a really interesting connection to think that possibly the ancient Egyptians saw Moses as this leprous outsider rebel. It's a really fascinating take on it. And then the whole thing about in Manetho's supposed account where the son of Pharaoh doesn't die, he gets sent away at a very young age. And rather than the gods being defeated in the plagues, Pharaoh hides the idols of the gods. Just really fascinating to me to see those little connections in there. And again, I want to stress, we don't actually know how much of this is an actual account from an ancient Egyptian historian named Manetho and how much Josephus put in around the time of Jesus. So it's possible that this is not actually the ancient Egyptian counterpoint to the Exodus story. But regardless of how old that part of the story is or not, I do love being able to see these different versions of the account. And you know what they say, history is written by the victors. And when it comes to this kind of ancient history, we're just used to reading the Jewish side of it from our Old Testaments. But this helps to remind us that there were actual people involved here. And even if you think the legends of these stories grew over time into the versions that we know today, as many scholars do believe, this helps to show us that there's multiple sides to these stories and there were actual people involved. It really just kind of helps to bring this all back down to reality, and you start to view it through more human eyes. Like, I don't know about you, but a lot of times when I read these biblical texts, it's easy to just think of it as almost like a fairy tale story. And I don't mean in truthfulness, but more in the way that I relate to the characters. Like, they just seem that they're in such a world apart from where we are today that it can sometimes be hard to relate to them. But this helps to make it more human. And so I really like being able to study these other stories and bring them in connection with the biblical text. So even if you walk away and you don't think that necessarily changes your view of the biblical text, like, that's okay. Just, it helps us to get in the minds of the ancient writers and see what the culture was like at that time and what they may have been drawing on for their work. So let's take a quick break, and then we'll come back and talk about some other correlations with ancient Egyptian culture that we find in the Exodus story. We have talked about Moses and the overlap with some other ancient stories, but that's not where the correlations end. So let's get into some more of these ancient traditions. First one I want to share with you is the wax crocodile. This story dates from about 1600 years before Jesus, but at least the version of it that we have, it's believed that it was recounted orally for many centuries before then. And it's the story of a chief lector priest in ancient Egypt whose name was Uba Iner. And it goes something like this. When day broke and the second day came, the garden caretaker informed Uba Iner of the matter, and he lit a fire, saying, "Bring me my chest of ebony and electrum." And he opened it and made a crocodile of wax 7 fingers long. He read out his magic words, saying, "If anyone comes to bathe in my lake, the townsman." We have a little bit of a missing part of the text there. Then he gave to the caretaker, and he said to him, "After the townsman goes down to the pool, as is his daily fashion, you shall cast the crocodile after him." The caretaker went forth, and he took the crocodile of wax with him. After night fell, the townsman returned as was his daily fashion, and the caretaker threw the crocodile of wax behind him into the water. At once it grew into a crocodile of 7 cubits length, and it took hold of the townsman. Uba Iner tarried with his majesty, the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Nebka the Vindicated, for 7 days, all while the townsman was in the lake without breathing. After the 7th day came, his majesty, the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Nebka the Vindicated, came forth, and the chief lector priest, Uba Iner, placed himself in the presence and said to him, "May your majesty come and see the marvel which has taken place in your majesty's time." His majesty went with Uba Iner, and he called out the crocodile and said, "Bring back the townsman." The crocodile came out of the water. Then the chief lector priest Uba Iner said, "Open up," and he opened up. Said his majesty the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Nebka the Vindicated, "This crocodile is indeed fearful." But Uba Iner bent down and he caught it, and it became a crocodile of wax in his hand. Yes, that is quite the story. But did you catch the connection at the end of the story with the account in Exodus of Moses appearing before Pharaoh? There's a similarity. Now, it's not quite point-for-point correspondence, but it's enough that some scholars have said, I wonder if there's a little bit of a connection here. Because when Moses casts his rod down before Pharaoh and it becomes a serpent, he then reaches down and grabs it by the tail and it becomes the staff again in his hand. Now, to be fair, the Uba Iner account does not mention his reaching out and taking the crocodile by the tail when this happens. But it is just interesting that we have 2 different stories here of an inanimate object turning into an animal that looks somewhat similar to it and then turning back again. Now, when we get to that particular passage talking about the signs in front of Pharaoh, we're going to talk about what Moses' serpent turns into. I'll just throw a little bit of a teaser there because it's not quite what you think it's going to be. It has a lot to do with sea serpents and ancient cosmology of the way that they thought the world worked and the monsters that existed in it. But there are some that have suggested that perhaps rather than a serpent, it was actually a crocodile that Moses' rod became. Now, I will disagree with that when we get to the passage, but it is worth noting because it would draw a further correlation between these 2 stories. Now, speaking of the staff turning into something else, we have yet another correlation with ancient Egyptian culture. It seems that some ancient Egyptians believed particularly skilled magicians could take inanimate objects and turn them into reptiles and then back into inanimate objects again. And we see this particularly in the way that many Egyptian pharaohs were depicted as herdsmen, where they would have a staff in one hand and oftentimes a snake in the other. And many times that imagery in ancient Egypt was used to depict the pharaoh as a herdsman, as a cattle driver. So we see a little bit of an inversion of that with Moses, where he's not a cattle herdsman, but rather a shepherd, and he's the one whose staff can turn into a serpent or some similar creature. And speaking of snakes, crocodiles, and sea serpents, we have some intriguing stories of waters parting in Egyptian mythology. Now, granted, this particular one that I'm referencing, we only have it accounted for in a text from a few hundred years before Jesus, but as with many of these myths, it seems that they are significantly older, and we just happen to have later copies that we have discovered. So this comes from, oh boy, I'm really going to butcher this, a text called, and I'm sorry, I'm going to butcher this, I do not have a good handle of Egyptian dialects, Setne Kamwas and Nanafer Kapta. It's often just called Setne 1, so we're going to go with that. The story goes that there was a magician prince named Nanefer Kapta, and he wanted to find this book, this scroll that had been written by the god Thoth. But Thoth had pulled in Yzma and put that box inside of another box, and basically Russian nesting dolled a bunch of boxes, and then dropped it in the middle of the Nile. So this prince, whose name I will mercifully not butcher again for you, he built a little toy boat, even with the little sailors on it, and then through a magic incantation brought the whole thing to life. And he then said to these sailors that had just been brought to life, and I quote, "Row me to the place where the book is." They rowed him by night as by day. In 3 days he reached it. He cast sand before him, and a gap formed in the river. He found 6 miles of serpents, scorpions, and all kinds of reptiles around the place where the book was. He found an eternal serpent around the same box. He recited a spell to the 6 miles of serpents, scorpions, and all kinds of reptiles that were around the box, and did not let them come up. And the prince does eventually get the book. But the main takeaway from this is that from within ancient Egyptian mythology, there was a belief that a particularly skilled magician could part the waters with the right magical incantations. Isn't it interesting then that we see Moses doing that later on in the story? We'll get to a little bit more of that when we eventually get there. We have several chapters to go before then. But let's take a look at another story that's kind of similar to the one that we just talked about. This is often just called the boating party story. And it's where you have Pharaoh's family that's relaxing on a boat in the middle of a lake, and one of the princesses accidentally drops a necklace into the water. And so the pharaoh, who is named Seneferu, tells his lector priest, who this time is named, again, I'm so sorry, Jaja M. Ankh. So, hey, if any of you know ancient Egyptian languages better than I do, feel free to correct me on that. But the king tells this priest, quote, "My brother, do as I have said. My majesty's heart was refreshed seeing them row. Then a pendant of new turquoise of one of the leaders fell into the water. She stopped rowing and thereby spoiled her side. I said to her, 'Why have you stopped rowing?' She said to me, 'Because the pendant of new turquoise fell into the water.' I said to her, 'Row, I will replace it for you.' She said, 'I prefer my thing to the one like it.' Then the chief lector priest said his say of magic. He placed one side of the lake's water upon the other, and he found the pendant lying on a shard. He brought it and gave it to its owner. Now the water that had been 12 cubits deep across had become 24 cubits when it was turned back. Then he said his say of magic and returned the waters of the lake to their place." So again, we have an Egyptian legend, possibly, that could have gone all the way back to the time of Moses or before. We don't know for sure because we don't have record of it going all that way back, but it seems likely. So you have the story that's now the biblical authors are playing with and saying, you thought that it was your people that could do this. Watch what our God can do through our leader. All right, I want to give you one other ancient Egyptian story to mull over before we move on here. And believe it or not, this legend is called the Night of the Slaying of the Firstborn. Reference to this is found in 2 different sets of text. One is called the Pyramid texts of the Old Kingdom, and the other is called the Coffin texts of the Middle Kingdom. Very fragmentary. We have almost no detail whatsoever mentioned, but we do have these quotes. This one comes from the Pyramid texts. "It is the king who will be judged with him whose name is hidden on this day of the slaying of the firstborn." All right, that's all we have of it. Weird reference, no elaboration. Here's the Coffin text one. "I am he who will be judged with him whose name is hidden on this night of the slaying of the firstborn. This night of the slaying of the firstborn, this day of the slaying of the firstborn." Kind of crazy, right? Now, some of you are probably jumping up and down and you're going, see, this proves the Bible is accurate. Well, not so fast, because believe it or not, the Pyramid texts and the Coffin texts that these are taken from are hundreds of years older than the Exodus. Now, I'm not just talking about when our record of the Exodus was. I'm not talking about like when the story was written down. Now, most of the time, we'll get to this in a few minutes, the Exodus is dated to somewhere around 1446 BCE. So about 1400 years before Jesus. The Pyramid texts are from about 2,300 years before Jesus, and the coffin texts are from about 2,000 years before Jesus. So we're talking anywhere from 500 to 1,000 years before the Exodus could have happened. The Egyptians had a very cryptic myth about the night of the slaying of the firstborn. That is wild. And scholars don't really know what to do with that, since these predate the biblical text, so it's not like it's some Egyptian response to the biblical account or anything like that. And it doesn't necessarily seem that the biblical account just copied and pasted that, but it appears that these stories may have been known at the time that the Bible's story was being written. And so the biblical authors may have drawn off of those stories and said, let's tell it with a spin where our God is the one who did that. So I share all this to remind you that the biblical text was not written in a vacuum. And that's not to say that what's in the Bible is not true. But sometimes we just have this idea that it's meant to be security camera footage, because that's the way that we like to think history should be told in our modern Western mindset. But in the ancient Near East, it was a little bit different, and it was okay to tell what we might call a theological history. And that's where you're not necessarily changing facts or putting anything forward for the intent to deceive, but rather you're telling the history in a way that is driven by your theology. And that's very much what the Exodus story is. And there's even a whole genre of Egyptian literature that's been called the Koningsnovel, and that's German. I also don't speak German well, so forgive my poor pronunciation there as well. But scholars have put together this motif that is apparently very common in ancient Egyptian literature, where you have some royal personality who usually has a dream that tells them that something needs to be done. And then they plan it out. The people are hesitant to follow them, but eventually they are successful in their attempt. And that is basically the storyline of Moses leading Israel out of Egypt, too. He has this vision of God on Sinai, and when he goes back to the people to lead them out, they are very skeptical, but he is actually able to lead them out of Egypt. So just remember, as we're going through all this, that the Bible was written within a culture, and it draws on that culture, and we don't have to be afraid of that. This is not attacking the Bible or saying that the Bible isn't worth reading because, there's these other connections to ancient literature. No, I think once you actually understand the way the Bible drew on the culture of its time, we can better appreciate the text for what it's doing. It also helps to remind us that there are multiple ways that good, Bible-believing, God-loving Christians can read these stories. And just because somebody might take a little bit of a different position on, say, the historicity of a particular event, or when the Exodus happened, or how the plagues actually took place, that's okay. We don't need to call somebody a heretic for having a different view than us. So with that reminder, let's take a quick breather, and then when we come back, we'll talk through some pitfalls we should try to avoid when studying Exodus. First off, let's be careful not to spiritualize the text. And this goes for any time we read the Bible, but we're in Exodus here, so we're just going to talk about it through the lens of Exodus. When you have a text of Scripture, there are several options of what you can do with it. And interpretation means that you are trying to get at the meaning of the text. So your interpretation is what you think the text actually means. What is the main point or points to take from this? And while many different interpretations can lend useful insights, when we're talking about a historical literary approach to the text, I'm most interested in what would this most likely have meant to the original audience. I realize that is not the only way to read the text. We can get useful interpretations other ways. But this is just my particular focus. And if you're listening to this podcast, I'm guessing that's your preference as well. You're most interested in what would this text have meant to the original audience. I make this distinction because spiritualization is a very common form of interpretation, but it does not get to the heart of what the text would have meant back when it was originally written. Spiritualization is when you're focusing on getting a modern-day application instead of focusing on the historical interpretation of the passage. So, for example, if you have the passage in 1 Samuel with David fighting Goliath, perhaps the preacher will try to draw some application by talking about slaying the giants in your life, maybe the giants of sin, or whatever it might be. That is spiritualizing the text, and that is what many of us have heard in church, where the minister is taking a passage of scripture and then trying to put some spiritual meaning on it. that wasn't actually intended there. That doesn't mean that we should entirely throw out those sermons or that they are of no use. Me personally, that's not my preferred style of preaching. I'm not so much interested in what you can read into this text as much as what you can pull out of this text from what was originally there. So, at the end of the day, you're not David and you don't have any actual giants in your life. It might feel like that, but that's not what the text originally would have meant. So we want to be careful not to over spiritualize this text. Like when I first taught through the first 10 to 12 chapters of Exodus, I was teaching a Sunday school class at my church, and I was given a curriculum book that talked through those particular passages. And I could not believe the amount of spiritualization that was in this text. And it was written by a fundamentalist Baptist who was very adamant about having the proper interpretation methods. The guy actually ran a Bible college. And yet, nearly every application he tried to present in the book was a massive over-spiritualization of the text. And this is just off of the first few pages. I saved this because I just blew my mind. This is not good interpretation method. It might make decent preaching, but it doesn't get at what the text is actually about. He was looking at Exodus 1, 8 through 10, which reads, "Now there arose up a new king over Egypt who knew not Joseph. And he said to his people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we are. Come now, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply. And it comes to pass that if any war happens, they will join to our enemies and fight against them and get up out of the land." Okay, so a proper historical literary interpretation of this is going to just say, this is an ancient pharaoh talking about these people in the land. He's afraid that there are too many of them and they could uprise against him. But no, the author of this book, the president of this Bible college, wrote, "Throughout the history of Christendom." All right, you should already be raising your eyebrows there because this is not about Christians. The Exodus took place 1400-ish years before Jesus, so we're already reading in. When you have something Old Testament and they start talking about Christianity, that's spiritualization. All right, so throughout the history of Christendom, Christians have also been viewed as trouble at times. In the book of Acts, Paul was referred to as, quote, "a pestilent fellow, the troublemaker of the Jews." Many times when people are faithful to the Lord, the culture at large will see them as the problem. Okay, I get the point he's trying to make. As a fundamentalist, he thinks that the world is constantly out to get them and everyone's mad at them just because they're Christians. Like, that is the fundamentalist mindset, saying that as someone who was one for 20 plus years. But this passage is not about people being persecuted for their faith. I mean, just set aside the whole bit about being over a millennia before Jesus, so there are no Christians here. This is not about Pharaoh persecuting the Jews because he didn't like their God. Yahweh is not even really brought in as a factor of this story until the plagues. This was all politically motivated. So the application that he draws out here, I want to be generous and say that there could be some people who maybe find some use in that, but it's eisegesis. It is reading into the text rather than exegesis, drawing out of the text what is already there. And I just can't help but throw this in. If you think that everyone hates you and your faithfulness is what makes you unpopular, maybe it's actually your disposition and the way you present your faith. Because I remember being a fundamentalist and thinking that people constantly hated on Christians. It's this war on Christianity and war on Christmas and all this stuff. And once you get out of that, you start to realize, like, oh, no, people aren't actually that way. We kind of invented enemies to feel like we had purpose in life. And it's sad. But I think a lot of times if somebody's looking funny at you for your beliefs, it's probably more about how you presented them than your actual beliefs themselves. So, all right, mini rant over. Back to the horrors of this curriculum. My favorite thing from it, and I took so many notes, I wish I had the time to just go through all of them and laugh at how ridiculous this guy's interpretation method was. But my favorite part was that he compared Moses before Pharaoh to witnessing, to sharing your faith with someone else. So he said that Pharaoh did not respond well to Moses witnessing to him, and that sometimes people's hearts will be hard to your sharing the gospel, just like Pharaoh's was to Moses. Okay, I'm sorry, Moses was not sharing the gospel with him. And for starters, gospel is a Christian idea, so again, extremely anachronistic. But he wasn't even trying to convert Pharaoh. He wasn't saying, believe on the God of Israel or anything. No, the message was just, let us go. Moses didn't give a crap what God Pharaoh followed. He just wanted to get out of the land. So to then compare that to sharing your testimony or door knocking or passing out tracts or whatever, I mean, remember, this is Baptist curricula, so that's what they were expecting you to do. That's not an accurate interpretation. And again, I'm trying to be nice. I don't want to say that that could never have any encouragement for anyone, but don't call that good preaching. Don't call that interpreting the biblical text, because that's not what the text means. Now, if you want to take that and run with it, fine. But you have to be okay with anyone coming up with any interpretation at that point, because you're just throwing all the context to the wind and saying all that matters is the point that I want to make. Doing that kind of interpretation, it takes our focus off of the obvious physical meanings of the text right before us and gets us on these rabbit trails of spiritualized applications. And I get it. We want the easy answers. We want something that we can say, hey, I read my Bible today, and here's the encouragement I got out of it. But the Bible is not a motivational daily journal. It's not a book where you can just flip to any page and get your little motivational quote for the day to keep going. And that's the way a lot of Christians treat it. And it's no wonder so many Christians get fed up with reading the Bible, because they are not reading it within its context. They're not looking for the actual historical story that is right in front of them. They're trying to turn it into some sort of Christian spiritualization. I mean, I've already said this several times. I'll just say it one more here. I want to be clear. Spiritualization is not always bad. I cannot stand it, but I am very heavily biased against that just because of my personality. If we're being honest, spiritualization has been the dominant form of biblical interpretation for the majority of the last 2,000 plus years. But when you divorce the biblical text from its context, you can easily make any passage say whatever you want it to, even if it was nowhere near what the authors originally intended. And that's not what we're interested in doing here. So the first pitfall that we are going to try to avoid in our Exodus study is spiritualizing the text. The second is trying to prove the Bible with science. This is something I see a lot of people doing in Exodus. Well-meaning Christians, in a desire to prove that their faith is true, will look to often dubious claims that are just generically scientific, and they'll say, archaeologists dug up chariot wheels in the Red Sea, and then scientists dated them, and that proves that the biblical account is true. Or they'll do it with cyanide, too. They'll say, this was originally a volcanic mountain. We found these scorch marks, and that must be where the burning bush was. And all this. Okay, whenever you hear something like that, first thing you do is take a deep breath in, a deep breath out, and the second thing you do is start asking questions. Be specific about this. Archaeologists found this exact spot in the Bible. Really? How sure are we of that? How can you actually know this is exactly where something took place? Like, it's nice when science matches the Bible, but the definition of science is getting less stuff wrong over time. So please don't stake your entire position on some inscription that was found, or an ancient tradition, or some chariot wheel or something. Like, those are fallible, and they're often falsified claims too. Like, we'll get into some of that more when we actually get to those particular chapters, but the Sinai location is debated. The Red Sea crossing location is debated. The location of the cities mentioned in some of the Exodus accounts, they're debated. We don't know exactly where these things happened, and in our attempt to try to justify our faith, we end up looking foolish when we make these claims that end up not being true. Like the chariot wheels is a big thing. And I'll link to an episode when we get to that chapter of the Leaving Eden podcast, where they kind of go into a deep dive on the chariot wheels and why that's all bunk. You know, if you hear someone say, well, scientists say, or archaeologists say, okay, well, science is a big field. What kind of scientists are we talking about here? Archaeology is not just digging up stuff. So are we talking about somebody who went under no government supervision and just started digging in places and claiming that they found things? Or are we talking about properly recorded, actually sanctioned archaeological digs? And just remember, the Bible is neither a science textbook nor a history textbook. Like we talked about a few minutes ago, it is heavily influenced by the culture of its day. There is nothing in the Bible to suggest that God supernaturally changed the understanding of the biblical writers so that they would know the earth is a globe rather than being flat, or so they would know about people living in the Americas, or have modern medical knowledge, or anything like that. We have to realize the Bible was a product of its time. And while I don't believe that science and faith are in opposition to each other, faith cannot, by definition, be proved. I don't have faith that 2 plus 2 equals 4. I know that 2 plus 2 equals 4 because I can have 2 of something and another 2 of something, put it together, and now I have 4 of that something. You can't do that with faith. And I know a lot of Christians want to try to. They want to feel validated in their faith. But just because you can't prove something doesn't mean it's not necessarily true. And it certainly doesn't mean that it's not meaningful to you or can have a great impact on your life. I just want us to be fair and honest here, because if we start treating the Bible like something that is constantly being proved by science and archaeology and all this stuff, then we start looking like fools. Because when people research this information, they realize that a lot of these stories are made up. So do a simple Google search. Find out if XYZ claim about archaeology discovered this, or we found chariot wheels, or we know the location of Sinai. Or do some searching and actually try to be honest in your presentation of your faith, even if it doesn't come across as certain as it might by making up all those different claims. Better to have an honest faith that you acknowledge to be what it is than trying to present it for something it's not. Again, I am not saying that science or archaeology or anything like that disproves the Bible. I'm just saying that we need to be careful when we take something that has an entirely different purpose and bring it into the religious sphere and say, this now proves my point that I'm right. And so that transitions me into my third point here of we need to try to avoid the pitfall of thinking in exact black and whites. It's really easy to slip into the fundamentalist tendency to say, this is the only accurate way to believe the Bible. And if you don't think that the Exodus happened at this particular date and everything happened exactly the way I say, then you're a heretic and you might as well not be a Christian. But that's not helpful. Good Christians can disagree on several of these points. One of the big ones when it comes to Exodus is the date of the Exodus. There has been a debate raging for centuries now over when this Exodus event happened. And there are several dates that get thrown out there, but the most common two are called the early date and the late date. And this is where we have to remember that when we're dealing with BCE, time before Jesus, it moves in the opposite direction of where it does now. So if you have, let's say, 100 BCE, the next year is 99, not 101 like we have today. So the early date is actually further back in time, 1446, while the late date is going to be a lower number because it's moving later in time toward Jesus, when then the years switch and start going the other way. So the late date is going to be sometime in the 1200s, usually like 1298 to 1187. Sometimes you'll get 1270, sometimes 1225. Like I said, there are several different theories there. But the early date is going to be the more conservative estimate. So this is where conservative scholars and theologians are going to land. They're often going to say 1446. 1,446 years before Jesus is when the Exodus happened. The later date in the 1200s or somewhere around there is typically going to be held by more liberal scholars. Now, that does not necessarily mean scholars who aren't Christians. There are good Bible-believing Christians who take that date as well. And I just want to take a second here and kind of explain some of this. I don't want to get into this too much because, in all honesty, we cannot know for sure when the Exodus would have happened. I know some of you, probably on the more fundamentalist side, are bristling and thinking, well, of course we can. Okay, well, it is really not as simple as you would think it is. And so much ink has been spilled over this, so many podcast episodes have been made. That's just not something that I find ridiculously important to this story. So I'm just going to give a quick overview here, but I would recommend checking out Michael Heiser's podcasts on Exodus. Specifically in the first few, he gets into some of this timeline debate, and he goes into way more detail than I have the patience to do with this. But a quick overview is that this early date of 1446 BC is the most common date applied in conservative interpretations. It takes a statement from 1 Kings 6:1, which reads, "It came to pass in the 480th year after the children of Israel were come up out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month Ziph, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord." So they look at that and they're going to read it very literally and say this means that Solomon's 4th year of reigning was 480 years after the Exodus. And since we know with pretty good accuracy when Solomon would have ruled, they start doing some basic math. Solomon would have reigned in the early to mid-900s BCE. Based on the way some math is done in the biblical genealogies, a lot of times these scholars will say 962 is when Solomon started to reign. They then work backwards and put the Exodus at 1446. That would then more than likely mean that the pharaoh of the Exodus was either Amenhotep I or Thutmose I. Now, what's really interesting, if it was Thutmose I, is that his daughter was Hatshepsut. So we have a prominent Egyptian female ruling at that time, or at least co-ruling at that general time. Some have even tried to draw a correlation to her stepson, Amenhotep II, because we didn't really have much of a record of his having any military victories after around 1446. And then the pharaoh that came after him, Thutmose IV, was sometimes seen as an illegitimate ruler. So perhaps if the pharaoh's son died in a plague, who's the next pharaoh to come on? Well, maybe it wasn't his son. Maybe it was someone who came from a little bit of a different line and therefore upset the balance of power. Now, while that all sounds nice and neat and like, oh yeah, we found out exactly when the Exodus happened, it's really not that simple. Because as we've mentioned in other episodes that have dealt with genealogies, the Bible's genealogies often skip generations in order to prove some sort of a theological point. They're just sharing the people that they're interested in. So when we're trying to draw an exact chronology off of the Bible's genealogies, we're going to run into issues. Another problem is that different ancient cultures use different calendars. I mean, even today, different cultures use different calendars. Not everyone uses the Gregorian calendar that we're used to. The calendar system that we are so used to today as fact is less than 500 years old. And it was based on a Roman-based calendar, but even that was not like the original calendar. Every people group had a different way of telling time, and it was often based on their rulers. So we sometimes have a little bit of difficulty overlapping. Okay, so we have this year in the biblical story. What does that exactly map onto, say, in an Egyptian calendar? Because sometimes they don't quite line up exactly right. So it can be hard to tell, what does this year in the Bible correspond to that year in the Egyptian calendar. There's also the matter of the Habiru that people sometimes bring in, and this can be spelled Apiru or sometimes Habiru. So either A-P-I-R-U or H-A-B-I-R-U. The Habiru were a people group mentioned in the Amarna letters, which date back from Bible times, and they talk about this people group going through the land of Canaan and causing destruction. And so some people will say, see, that must be the Israelites, and the way they then tell the time from that gets it back to around the same chronology as the 1446 date. But we don't actually know for sure that those would have been the same people as the Israelites that left Egypt. Further complicating matters is when people start talking about the Hyksos dynasty in Egypt. Now, I am not an Egyptologist by any means, but from what I understand, the Hyksos were a foreign group of people who somehow took over power in Egypt for a while. That you might hear talk of different dynasties in ancient Egypt. That way of dating time in ancient Egypt actually goes back to Manetho that we talked about at the start of the episode, the Egyptian historian priest. He supposedly divided up Egyptian history into about 30 different dynasties based on ruling families. So whenever the ruling family changed, it would be a new dynasty. And there's this weird bubble of time where a bunch of foreigners came in and ruled over Egypt for a while, and they were called the Hyksos. And for years now, people have tried to equate the Israelites with the Hyksos because the Hyksos were Semites, like the Israelites were. But you start to run into issues because the Hyksos ruled over Egypt from around 1650 to 1550 BCE. So even if you're taking the early date of the Exodus, we're talking 100 to 200 years before the Exodus would have happened. And some people try to connect that to the story of Joseph and how he partially ruled over Egypt, but there's no indication that his family continued to rule over Egypt. And he was only second in command anyway, behind the pharaoh, so it's not like he himself was a pharaoh. And you also have the matter of the Bible speaking of Israel being in the land of Egypt for about 400 years. So that doesn't really connect with the Hyksos just being a couple hundred years before the Exodus supposedly would have happened. Unless maybe you take the late date. So let's talk about that for a second. The late date, roughly around 1225, is also a legitimate way of viewing this story. And there are ways you can get to this later date from within the Bible, but it's also heavily supported through some evidence external to the Bible. One thing that a lot of people will point to is that the name Ramses is used of a city in Exodus 1, and Ramses was a popular name for the pharaohs around the 1300s and 1200s BCE. This could also potentially line up with a time where archaeology has suggested a large-scale destruction that happened in the land of Canaan. There's also supposedly an abandoned slave town from that particular era in Egyptian history that has been found. There's mass graves of infants from around that time period. Egyptian history from that time talks about it being a very chaotic period. And again, if you are interested in that sort of debate, you can go check out Heiser's episodes on it, and there's plenty of other resources online. The main point I want to get across is that we don't actually know exactly when this would have happened. And good people can disagree on this. You can be a Bible-believing, faithful Christian and take the later date. That does not make you some liberal heretic. But just realize that whatever position you're taking has arguments for and against it. There is no perfect date to look at. And even the one that's supposedly just based on the timeline within the Bible has holes in it as well. And like we talked about a few minutes ago, we have to be careful about appealing to just generic archaeology and discoveries that may or may not have any connection to the biblical text. It's hard to tell when we're dealing with things that are 3,000 plus years old at this point. Okay, so hold your positions with an open hand and speak of them humbly with other people. Just because someone disagrees with you on the date of the Exodus does not mean that they are a heretic or a bad person. And this goes for other parts of Exodus too. Like we'll get to the Red Sea issue. And I remember growing up hearing that liberal Bible deniers say it wasn't the Red Sea, it was the Sea of Reeds. And that doesn't even make sense because the Sea of Reeds is far shallower than the Red Sea is. And so they're just trying to say that the parting of the Red Sea wasn't actually that big of a deal. Okay, well, when we get to that passage, we're going to see Red Sea is not in the text. And there's a reason that many scholars have said Reed Sea instead of Red Sea. And we'll get to all that. But for right now, just realize Bible scholars are not a bunch of liberal heretics and Bible deniers and Satanists that are sitting in secret meetings, rubbing their hands together and saying, all right, let's try to find some way to destroy the biblical text. No, these are people who have devoted their lives to understanding your sacred scriptures and trying to help you understand them better. Now, no one's perfect, but if the majority of scholars say one thing, it's worth listening to. All right, let's take a quick break, and we'll come back and address a couple more pitfalls we want to avoid in studying Exodus. The fourth pitfall to avoid is kind of a cousin to spiritualizing, and it's where you treat the protagonist of the biblical story as a moral example. Just because the main character did this, it's good. I don't think people realize how often they do that when they read the Bible, because they'll admit, Moses did some bad things, like he killed the Egyptian, right? That's obviously bad. But somehow, when it's not as clear, flashing lights as that at us, we just tend to assume the main character is doing the right thing. And that's not always the case. Like, for example, when we get to that story of Moses killing the Egyptian and then running into exile, should he have revealed himself at that point? It's easy to think, yeah, he did the right thing in stepping in, but could he maybe have been better equipped to deliver Israel if he had stayed within Pharaoh's court? I realize that's kind of a what-if game, and you can go down all kinds of rabbit trails with that. But even a little later on, and this will be beyond the scope of our series, but in Exodus 18, Moses splits up the leadership of the people at the advice of his father-in-law. And it's easy to think that that's a good thing to do, and maybe it was. But maybe it wasn't, too, because the biblical authors actually don't specify that that's what God wanted Moses to do in that case. And so it's possible to read that as a negative thing when God gave Moses the authority over the people. Maybe God didn't want him to divvy it up to others as well. See, you end up in trouble when you assume that the Bible is always painting a positive picture of the protagonist. It's trying to paint a theologically, historically accurate picture. It's up to you to decide through careful study whether or not it's a positive one. There's the verse that says that these stories are examples for us. Well, it never says if they're good examples or bad examples. And we need to be careful with our study to make sure we're not turning this into some sort of a moral example. Well, Moses did this, therefore we should do this. Not necessarily. Fifth is reading Jesus back into the text. This is something a lot of Christians do, is they read the Bible backwards. And I get it. Christianity is based mainly on the New Testament. Like, yes, we have the foundation of the Tanakh as well, but most of what you're going to hear in church on Sunday is going to be New Testament stuff. And so, since we've based our entire belief system around this person, Jesus, we often like to imagine him as being at the core of the entirety of the Bible. And while I think it's fine and fair as a Christian to say that the Bible points to Jesus and that Jesus is the fulfillment of the Bible's message, I do not think it is good interpretation to read Jesus back into these stories. Again, there is nothing in the Bible to suggest that God supernaturally downloaded a knowledge of future events to these biblical authors. They would not have known of Jesus. They would not have known that hundreds upon hundreds of years in the future, someone named Jesus would die on a cross. So while I understand the Christian urge to find Jesus in these texts, we have to remember that these were sacred texts for the Jewish people for hundreds of years before we Christians came along and co-opted the text. So let's be careful not to turn these into Christian texts. We have to let them stand as what they are. So when we get to, say, Passover, was the Passover lamb meant to point to Jesus? Or was Jesus perhaps described as a lamb because the Passover passages already existed? I know that might sound like semantics, but it's actually a big difference. We want to read the Bible forwards. You read a book from start to finish. You don't read backwards. And if you get to the story of the Passover and just start talking about Jesus as the Lamb of God, you're missing all of what that story meant in its context. That's not to say it's completely invalid to point to Jesus as the Lamb of God, but I think it's far better to do that chronologically, to say that when Jesus came on the scene, he was described as the Lamb of God because of those Passover passages. So the biblical authors were trying to draw back on pre-existent scripture and tie Jesus in with that. Not that the biblical authors from Exodus were trying to point to Jesus with the story. The same thing happens with the blood on the doorposts during the 10th plague. I always heard that as it's a sign of the cross because there was blood on the left side, the top, and the right side. And if you draw a line between each, you get a cross. And that completely missed that there was no connection point at the bottom, but whatever. And it also just misses the point of the story itself. I don't really have a problem if you want to draw analogies from Jesus back onto the text from the Tanakh. But let's just be careful not to assume that that was the main meaning back then. Now, those texts meant something long before Christianity came around. And so we want to respect the Bible for what it is and realize that we are the latecomers in this spiritual tradition. Not every page of Scripture needs to have Jesus hidden in it somewhere for it to have meaning to us as Christians. So here is how I recommend studying Exodus, or really any book of the Bible. Spend as much time as you can learning as much background as you can. Then pretend like you're reading the story for the very first time. You don't know who any of these people or places are. You don't know that over 1,000 years into the future, a Savior is going to be born named Jesus and die on a cross. Pretend that you are an ancient Israelite hearing this story. Maybe even listen to an audio version, since the average ancient person couldn't read. And you'll likely start to find stuff that you didn't know was there. I hate to take you back to elementary school here for a minute, but ask those basic questions you learned in elementary school literature classes. Who, what, where, when, and why. And create a list of what sticks out to you. I would even suggest read in a different version than what you were used to. If you're used to reading the King James, read it in an ESV. If you're used to reading the ESV, read it in the Message. Or whatever. Just pick a version that you don't normally read and read it from that one. It helps to make the text feel new to you. Oh, and read in as large of a chunk as possible. So don't just read one chapter, try to read several. Try to figure out where does this story naturally break. And don't necessarily trust the chapter divisions to be the best break in the story. So going about Bible study this way really helps you to view the text with fresh eyes, because we all come to it with baggage, and often we don't realize what that baggage is. So doing all of these steps, reading in a different Bible version, maybe listen to an audio, asking those who, what, where, when, why questions, pretending like you don't know any of the characters, not even Moses, not even Yahweh. Heck, you don't even know where Egypt is, right? Just asking those basic questions. really helps you start to see the narrative threads that you might have missed before. And speaking of those narrative threads, let's take a few minutes here at the end and talk about some key themes that we will find in these chapters. All right, here are some key themes to look out for as we study through Exodus. These are all going to pop up throughout the story. First off is salvation. Now, when I say that, I don't mean spiritual salvation. I don't mean the kind of thing that you hear preached in church every week. Would you believe that Exodus is the first time a word for salvation is used in the biblical story? That's right, there is no word of salvation mentioned in Genesis. It's here in Exodus that this theme gets introduced. And when you stop and think about it, it really makes sense. Because while we have super spiritualized the term salvation to the point that it basically just means becoming a Christian, salvation at its core just means deliverance. Like I could say I saved somebody from drowning. That has no spiritual connotation, right? I'm just saying I delivered them from a death of drowning. So if we kind of strip away all of that spiritualization and realize that salvation is about deliverance, that is what this whole book is about. It is about being delivered from slavery. And so the biblical portrait of salvation is actually much more physically grounded than what we often preach in church. Now, I'm not saying there's no place to talk about salvation in a spiritual sense, but a lot of times when the Bible is talking about salvation, it has a very real, very physical, very tangible dynamic to it about being delivered from some present danger. The second key theme, and you might never hear this preached on depending on what kind of church you go to, is about the oppressive misuse of power. I know in the circles I was raised in, we were very anti any kind of social gospel. We thought the gospel had to be entirely spiritual, and if anyone starts talking about power, liberation, equality, all that stuff, social change, that is a corruption of the gospel. Well, since salvation in the Bible, and particularly in Exodus, is very physically based about getting people out of slavery, well, we kind of can't ignore this theme either. And that might make some of us uncomfortable, especially if we came from a relatively privileged background. Like, I'm a white guy. I've realized I have a pretty privileged background. So, if anything, I'm not really going to be comparing myself to Israel in these stories. I'm going to be more in the position of Pharaoh because I'm the one with power. And I have to be thinking not of how other people have misused power against me, but maybe how have I misused it against others. It's so easy to read ourselves in as the protagonists when often we're actually more like the antagonists in the story. So a faithful reading of Exodus leans heavily on preaching against the misuse of power by oppressing other people under you. Along with that is this mindset of scarcity versus abundance. This is a theme that Bible Project has done a great job drawing out in multiple passages of Scripture. We'll talk about this when we get into chapter 1 next week. But there is a difference between people who view the world as having a scarcity of resources, and so I need to take for myself and my clan, versus those who see the world as having an abundance of resources, and there will be enough I don't need to grasp in order to take from someone else to take care of myself or my clan. There's enough to go around. So that's a big theme in this book. A fourth big theme, and granted, this will not be so much in the part we're in, this is more the second half of Exodus, but it's atonement. And this is all about being reunited with God. So while we get into that more at Sinai, it is a theme that carries through the book because the whole reason God wants to bring Israel out of Egypt is so that they can be reunited with him freely. So that is an expansion on the Genesis themes of this Eden connection between heaven and earth, God and humanity. Oh, and along with that, I should mention the theme of Eden itself, being fruitful and multiplying. We get that right at the very start of Exodus here, where the children of Israel are said to be fruitful and multiplying to the point that Pharaoh becomes scared of them. So be on the lookout for Eden hyperlinks all throughout this story. The next big key theme to keep an eye out for in the story is Yahweh's identity among the gods. This is something I've touched on and off throughout the podcast, and we're going to get into a lot more in this series, is that we in the modern West, we like to think that the gods of these ancient stories, they were all just fake. Like they were just idols. There was no reality to it whatsoever. The only real spiritual being out there, the only real God out there is our God, Yahweh. But that's not what the biblical authors believed. They believed that the gods of these other nations were very real and that they had very real power. Now, Yahweh was the greatest, But the other gods were not just idols, they were actual spiritual beings. That is the view that the biblical authors had. And that's going to play in huge, particularly when we get to the plagues. So I realize that's a topic that can be thorny for some people if they are not used to it. It can sound really weird to start talking about the gods of the nations in the Bible as being real. But that is the way that the biblical authors viewed it. And if you'd like more information on that, I definitely recommend checking out both Michael Heiser and Brian Godawa, as they have put an incredible amount of time and effort into teaching that side of the Bible that we don't often get in the modern West. So keep your eyes peeled for that as we go through the story. And I mean, we'll talk about more with God too, like the issues of his violence in the book, and even predestination, hardening Pharaoh's heart, all that. We have all that coming up for sure. Order versus chaos are big themes in this book. And that traces all the way back to Genesis as well, right? Because you have the chaos of pre-creation, the tohu vavohu, wild and waste, and then God speaks order into it. We're going to see a lot of that here in Exodus. In fact, we're going to see decreation language used, where it's almost like God inverts the creation order. We're going to see themes of priesthood. This is another one that comes up more in the second half of the book, but it is played out through the first half, and it certainly draws back to the garden as well, where the man and woman were placed as priests of Yahweh there. And the last big theme to keep an eye out for is instruction. And that's actually the Hebrew word Torah, because Exodus recounts when God gave the Torah to Moses on Sinai. So that will be a big theme, mostly in the second half of the book, but it'll play in as well here. Last note that I forgot to give earlier, and this is huge, I definitely want to mention this, is that the story is laid out to have Moses' life foreshadow Israel. So we'll see, like, for example, Moses is delivered through the water. He's put in the basket as a baby, and he is saved through the water. Likewise, Israel is going to be saved, delivered by going through the sea. Moses goes to Mount Sinai early on in the story after he flees Egypt, and Israel will later go to Sinai as well. So the story is very purposefully laid out to have the beats match between Moses' journey out of Egypt and Israel's journey out of Egypt. So keep an eye out for that as well as we go through. All right, how you feeling going into Exodus here? I realize I just dumped a ton of information on you, but this is all really important stuff moving forward for our study. And if you can, I would encourage you, before you get into the series in the next couple weeks here, go back and reread Exodus 1 through, let's just say 15, roughly where I think the series is going to end. And just try to get that whole thing down in one setting. Do it in a different Bible version than you're used to, like we talked about earlier. And just start writing down some notes of things that stand out to you, questions that you have, things you're unsure of, things that maybe you thought you knew for sure, but maybe you're questioning it a little bit now. I would love to hear from you all before we get into this series. What thoughts do you have on Exodus? Do you remember hearing it preached much? Do you have questions about any particular passages or what something would have meant that we can address as we do our Q&R episodes? Remember, you can always reach out to us via email, cconn@thebibleuncut.com. You can write in on our website homepage. You can always comment on our socials. We have a new Discord up, and the link to that is in the show notes. I want to hear from you, and I hope you're excited about this series, because I know I am. I have loved Exodus. It's actually been one of my favorite Bible books for quite a while now. I think it's probably because I had a children's pastor that really focused on teaching Old Testament stuff when I was little, and he spent a while in Exodus. While I don't think I'm going to end up presenting the texts quite the same way he did, it just really instilled a love of this book in me at an early age. And there's just so much incredible stuff that we have to talk about. Like, if you thought the things that we pulled in from other cultures with Genesis was crazy, wait until we get through Exodus. It is going to be a wild ride. I cannot wait for it. So until next week, stay curious and keep asking questions about the Uncut and Unfiltered Bible. You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.